Thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening for Zain Jaffar's reading tonight, especially given the weather. I know it's not that great out there, so I really appreciate your presence. This is a little bit of a longer introduction than I normally do, just because I'm so excited that Zain is here, and just having Middle Eastern brothers and sisters on campus together to kind of think about our literature and our traditions and how they're intersecting with the American literary tradition and innovating the technology of the novel is just such a nice opportunity. So I feel like I have so much to say, and it now falls on you. So, in a short piece titled Museum, Borges writes, "In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers' Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The desire to map the universe, land and sea and human interiority, to superimpose the two in order to arrive at a near complete picture of our collective condition, lies at the heart of Zain's first novel. In the map of salt and stars, we encounter two narrators, one nested in the other. Rawiya, our medieval Islamic narrator, who disguises herself as a boy in order to learn the art of map-making, and Noor, our contemporary narrator, who is fleeing the Syrian war, and whose ability to correctly recall Rawiya's story ensures her survival across treacherous terrain. Early on in the novel, Rawiya is asked the following question: what is the map you take with you everywhere you go? The map that guides, sustains you through field and sun and snow. In order for her to become a disciple to the world's most famous cartographer, she must answer this riddle. After thinking for some time, she answers, the blood makes a kind of map, a net of roads in the body. This conception of the body as a map, and of the landscape as a body, combined with the notion that the acquisition and transmission of knowledge is an ethereal practice that requires both mystical devotion and a radical acceptance of the opaque nature of reality, communicate to the reader that they are about to be immersed in a novel which logic and sense of spatiality and temporality are informed as much by Islamic mysticism as they are by the contemporary humanitarian crises that have displaced thousands of people in the Levant. The logic continues to build. Shortly after the riddle scene, we encounter Noor whispering Rawiya's story into the roots of a fig tree in their garden and homes, in the hopes that the tree will transmit the story to her father who lays buried in Manhattan. The gesture of speaking to the fig tree reveals a kinship with the land that is unbreakable. It's one of my favorite scenes in the novel. It's an act of resistance to the powers of colonialism and its arbitrary establishment of borders in the region. The tree does not ask us to articulate our humanity as Syrians, Iraqis, Iranians, Palestinians. The trees assume and affirm it. They coexist with us in a complex network, in community, and their ability to stay intact depends on the community's well-being and vice versa. Noor thinks back to her fig tree in homes as she travels to Jordan and Egypt and Libya and Morocco, on foot, by ferry, and by car. Will I get to finish my story, she wonders. Her story, which is also the story of Rawiya. The novel, told from this dual perspective, the medieval and the contemporary, begins to unfold into a mise en abîme, a decentered infinite space with no beginning and no end, a rhizomatic interconnected space, an expansive network of roots that speaks to the Arabic and Persian literary traditions and that undoes the centralized linear colonial logic of the West. As a result, the novel asks us to reflect on a few different things. Where does language reside? Where do the voices of our ancestors reside? Do they become distorted by violence, or does our ability to hear them become compromised? Who gets to tell their stories on their own terms? What happens when our stories are interrupted by history? What is the relationship between our pain and displacement and the logic of colonial capitalism? What do we do with ourselves when the struggle to search for home becomes our new home, the very site where we eat, breathe, and sleep? And what of those of us for whom the world has ended many times? As Ruia learns, will end and begin and end and begin forever, on and on, just like it has since the dawn of time. Time which is God herself, she says. Where are we in the apocalyptic narrative of the now? We whose life worlds have been under siege before this new end even arrived. The Map of Salt and Stars is a novel of resistance and resilience, a gesture of counter-mapping that turns the gaze of those of us from the region back onto our perpetrators under whose military surveillance we have learned to survive. Zain Jukhadar is the author of the novels The Map of Salt and Stars, his first novel, and The 30 Names of Night, which I'm really excited to share is coming out in May, right? He's a member of the Radius of Arab American Writers, and his work has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and The Map of Salt and Stars is currently being translated into 16 languages. Or is it 20? It has won a 2018 Middle East Book Award in Youth Literature, and a 2018 Goodreads Choice Awards finalist in historical fiction, and was shortlisted for the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize. So please help me in welcoming Zain to Notre Dame. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? This is on, right? Okay, good.
It's on. Do you want to lift it or is it fine?
Yeah, we'll just
I'm
like afraid I'm being really delicate with this. Like, let me not break this, you know. First thing I do when I get up here. Thank you so much. That was, I think that may be like the best introduction anybody has given me. Thank you. So yeah, I'm actually, if you don't mind, I'll put a little timer on it so I don't go completely over and just keep talking. I wanted to start off by just talking maybe a little bit about how I came to write and to research the book, and then to talk a little bit about some of the themes that, as I even mentioned, like to expound on some of those things a little bit more, and then I thought I'd move into reading you a few passages, and then we can move on to questions at the end. So basically, when I think about how this novel really started, like the seed of what it was, I was talking about it today, actually, in class, that it started out as me thinking about, in the midst of what was happening in 2015 in Syria, the war had been underway already for 4 years, and obviously since that time has gone on. But at that point in time, I had been thinking a lot about my positionality here in the U.S. as somebody that had grown up in diaspora, somebody that was Arab American, somebody that was Syrian American, and how that was a really specific identity, and what that meant for my relationship to people that were in Syria or who had left Syria as refugees or as migrants or people who had a different relationship to Syria than I did, let's say. And I started to try to conceive of that group of people, myself included, as a kind of community. And I thought, like, if we could define ourselves in that way, if we do form a community, what are we linked by in terms of our shared history, our shared culture, our shared language, but also in terms of our shared pain and shared trauma, and are there, if that is true, right? If we do share trauma in some way, even if for some of us it's indirect and for some of us it's obviously direct, then what can we offer to each other? A lot of this book was actually me thinking about that question, about what can I offer to my greater community. I had to be, and I think this is really important in general for any writer. I wanted to be really intentional about where I sat in the intersection of all of my identities and my relationship to the region and my relationship to language and my relationship to my own culture and my relationship also to America. And I wanted to, as I was sort of conceiving of how I would tell the story and of who would tell the story, who the protagonist would be, I was really, really conscious and intentional about choosing a narrator that I felt that I could write authentically, and from a position where I would be less likely to do harm. Because I think that we can very very easily do harm when we try to sort of go out of our lane, as they say. Like if I had told the story from the perspective, for example, of someone who's born and raised in Syria, one, it would have been a very different story, but also it wouldn't necessarily have been my story to tell, and I don't think that I could have told it in the way that I was able to tell a story about somebody who was Syrian American, who starts out, the story actually starts in New York, and then moves into Syria. And that was important for me as a writer to sort of acknowledge and say, I have to acknowledge my own positionality here, but also I think that it ended up being very important for the story itself, because the story I was telling was a story of exile. It was a story of displacement. It was a story of diaspora in a lot of ways, right? Because there's this character who loses home twice. She leaves New York, goes to Syria, and then loses Syria. And so there's this double loss. And so when I was thinking about all of this, my main goal was basically to say, what do I have to offer? I'm not there, and that means certain things. But I am of there in a certain way, in a different way maybe than other people are, right? But like, I'm still of that place, of those people, of these stories. And what I ended up deciding was that, one thing that I could offer were stories. I could offer maybe an alternative narrative to the one that I was coming across living here, and the sort of dominant narrative in Western media about Syria. I was, at the time, in 2015, and this only got more pronounced as the years went on, but one thing I was very cognizant of was that the way that Syria was being talked about, still is being talked about, and this applies to other communities as well, especially from the region that we call the Middle East, and we can talk about what that term means later, but from Southwest Asia, from North Africa, from the Levant. The way that these regions are being talked about, the way that Muslims and Arabs are being talked about, the way that Iranians are being talked about, we very rarely actually get to tell our stories ourselves. We very rarely get to control what narrative is given about us, and stories and narratives have massive impact. I mean, these have like direct impacts on the ways that imperialism acts in these regions, the ways that colonialism acts. Stories are not sort of abstract. I mean, they have real world consequences as well. Stories can be tools of war and violence also. If you think about it, even something like borders are also a kind of story, right? And the story gets told by the person with the power. The borders get drawn by the people with the power. And so who gets to have the power to tell those stories and what those stories contain? It's a very powerful thing and tells you a lot about power itself. And so, knowing that, I wanted to go into this story and say, I'm going to tell a story wherein someone who is linked to Syria, who is Syrian American, who is Arab, who is Muslim, is going to tell this story in a different way, and is going to tell it from within the community as opposed to outside of the community imposing a story or a narrative on us. And that was really important to me, and I wanted to offer a narrative that was one of that would actually allow the reader, if the reader was of that community, to sort of come to that conclusion himself of saying, your voice and the way that you tell the story of what you've been through does matter, that you can tell your own story, that it does matter that you tell your own story. And in that way to try to reverse the gaze, as we were talking about, to reverse the gaze of imperialism, American imperialism, and European imperialism, to reverse the gaze of colonialism, to reverse the gaze of racism and Islamophobia, and to try to turn it back and say, I'm not going to write directly to American imperialism, to whiteness, to just U.S. policy in the region. I'm not answering to that. It was really important to me that I did that, but I said, that's not going to be my primary goal here. My primary goal is to speak to my community and to try to put them at the center of my story. And actually, a lot of my work involves decentering the Western canon, and to try to put at the center of my work the literary lineage, I guess you could say, that I come from, that my ancestors come from, the way that we tell stories. And the reason that I chose this format is actually because in traditional Arab oral storytelling techniques, we do interweave multiple stories. And that's really, that's something that's sort of been imprinted on me as a result of who I am, from a pretty early age. And so to me, that's the way that I conceive of stories in general, is that stories do intersect with each and do reflect on each other, and that interaction and that intersection and that interweaving is really important to how you tell the story. So that was my major goal here, and I would love to talk more about this in the Q&A. Let me just check on the time though, because I think that maybe I'll move into reading a few passages, if that's all right. Okay. So I'm aware that not everybody in the room has read the book, right? So I thought maybe I would start with the opening passage. You've heard a little bit about this too, and the riddles and things. So I thought it could be good to start there. So this is preceded as well by a poem, a shape poem in the form of Syria, which I won't read here, but that was also part of how I told the story. It was sort of getting into how the characters are actually interacting with space and how I don't want to spoil it, but how they conceive of tying their experiences and their memories and their emotions to a place, and how that can form its own sort of borders. So anyway, let me not go into that now. We can talk about that more later. Okay. So this is from the first chapter, which is called The Earth and the Thick. The island of Manhattan's got holes in it, and that's where Baba sleeps. When I said goodnight to him, the white bundle of him sagged so heavy, the hole they dug for him so deep. And there was a hole in me too, and that's where my voice went. It went into the earth with Baba, deep in the white bone of the earth, and now it's gone. My words sunk down like seeds, my vowels and the red space for stories crushed under my tongue. I think Mama lost her words too, because instead of talking, her tears watered everything in the apartment. That winter I found salt everywhere, under the coils of the electric burners, between my shoelaces and the envelopes of bills, on the skins of pomegranates in the gold-trimmed fruit bowl. The phone rang with calls from Syria, and Mama wrestled salt from the cord, fighting to untwist the coils. Before Baba died, we hardly ever got calls from Syria, just emails. But Mama said in an emergency, you've got to hear a person's voice. It seemed like the only voice Mama had left spoke in Arabic. Even when the neighbor ladies brought casseroles and white carnations, Mama swallowed the words. How come people only ever have one language for grief? That winter was the first time I heard Abu Saeed's honey yellow voice. Huda and I sat outside the kitchen and listened sometimes. Huda's ash-brown curls crushed against the door jamb like spooled wool. Huda couldn't see the color of his voice like I could, but we both know it was Abu Saeed calling because Mama's voice would click into place, like every word she'd said in English was only a shadow of itself. Huda figured it out before I did, that Abu Saeed and Baba were two knots on the same string, a thread Mama was afraid to lose the end of. Mama told Abu Saeed what my sisters had been whispering about for weeks, the unopened electricity bills, the maps that wouldn't sell, the last bridge Baba built before he got sick. Abu Saeed said he knew people at the university in Homs, and he could help Mama sell her maps. He asked, what better place to raise 3 girls than the land that holds their grandparents? When Mama showed us our plane tickets to Syria, the O in my name, Noor, was a thin blot of salt. My older sisters, Huda and Zahra, pestered her about the protests in Daraa, things we'd seen on the news. But Mama told them not to be silly, that Daraa was as far south of Homs as Baltimore was from Manhattan. And Mama would know, because she makes maps for a living. Mama was sure things would calm down, that the reforms the government had promised would allow Syria to hope and shine again. And even though I didn't want to leave, I was excited to meet Abu Saeed, excited to see Mama smiling again. I had only ever seen Abu Saeed in Baba's Polaroids from the 70s, before Baba left Syria. Abu Saeed had a mustache and an orange shirt then, laughing with someone out of the frame, Baba always just behind him. Baba never called Abu Saeed his brother, but I knew that's what he was because he was everywhere, eating iftar on Ramadan evenings, playing cards with Sitbo, grinning at a cafe table. Baba's family had taken him in. They had made him their own. When spring came, the horse chestnut trees bloomed white like fat grains of rock salt under our window. We left the Manhattan apartment and the tear-encrusted pomegranates. The plane's wheels lifted like birds' feet, and I squinted out the window at the narrow stripe of city where I'd lived for 12 whole years and at the hollow green scooped out by Central Park. I looked for Baba, but with the city so far down, I couldn't see the holes anymore. Mama once said the city was a map of all the people who lived and died in it, and Baba said every map was really a story. That's how Baba was. People paid him to design bridges, but he told his stories for free. When Mama painted a map and the compass rose, Baba pointed out invisible sea monsters in the margins. The winter before Baba went into the earth, he never missed a bedtime story. Some of them were short, like the one about the fig tree that grew in Baba's backyard when he was a little boy in Syria, and some of them were epics, so twisting and incredible that I had to wait night after night to hear more. Baba made my favorite one, the story of the mapmaker's apprentice, last 2 whole months. Mama listened at the door, getting Baba a glass of water when he got hoarse. When he lost his voice, I told the ending. Then the story was ours. Mama used to say stories were how Baba made sense of things. He had to untangle the world's knots, she said. Now, 30,000 feet above him, I am trying to untangle the knot he left in me. He said one day I'd tell our story back to him. But my words are wild country, and I don't have a map. I press my face to the plain window. On the island under us, Manhattan's holes look like lace. I look for the one where Baba is sleeping and try to remember how the story starts. My words tumble through the glass, falling to the earth. August in Homs is hot and rainless. It's been 3 months since we moved to Syria, and Mama doesn't leave her tears on the pomegranates anymore. She doesn't leave them anywhere. Today, like every day, I look for the salt where I left my voice, in the earth. I go out to the fig tree in Mama's garden, standing heavy with fruit, just the way I imagined the fig Baba once had in his backyard. I press my nose to the fig's roots and breathe in. I'm belly down, stone heat in my ribs, my hand up to the knuckles in reddish dirt. I want the fig to carry a story back to Baba on the other side of the ocean. I lean in to whisper, brushing the roots with my upper lip. I taste purple air and oil. A yellow bird taps the ground looking for worms, but the sea dried up here a long time ago, if it was ever here at all. Is Baba still lying where we left him, brown and stiff and dry as kindling? If I went back, would I have the big tears I should have had then, or is the sea dried up in me forever? I rub the smell of water out of the fig's bark. I tell Baba our story, and maybe I'll find my way back to that place where my voice went, and Baba and I won't be so alone. I ask the tree to take my story and its roots, and send it down where it's dark, where Baba sleeps. Make sure he gets it, I say. Our favorite, Rawiya and Al-Idrisi, the one Baba told me every night, the one where they map the world. But the earth and the fig don't know the story like I do, so I tell it again. I start the way Baba always did. Everybody knows the story of Rawiya, I whisper. They just don't know that they know it. And then the words come back like they had never left, like it had been me telling the story all along. Inside, Huda and Mama clanked wooden bowls and porcelain. I forgot all about the special dinner for Abu Saeed tonight. I might not be able to finish the story before Mama calls me in to help, her voice all red edges. I press my nose to the ground and promise the fig I'll find a way to finish. No matter where I am, I say, I'll put my story in the ground and the water, and then it'll get back to Baba, and it'll get to you too. I imagine the vibrations of my voice traveling thousands of miles, cracking through the planet's crust, between the tectonic plates we learned about in science class last winter, burrowing into the dark, where everything sleeps, where the world is all colors at once, where nobody dies. I start again. So I'll go on to the next section. So the next section is one of the sections of Rawiya. This is where the story actually breaks into that story, into that sort of historical fable. Everybody knows the story of Rawiya. They just don't know they know it. Once there was, and was not, a poor widow's daughter named Rawiya, whose family was slowly starving. Rawiya's village, Bensoul, lay by the sea in Ceuta, a city in modern-day Spain, a tiny district on an African peninsula that sticks into the Strait of Gibraltar. Rawiya dreamed of seeing the world, but she and her mother could barely afford couscous, even with the money Rawiya's brother, Salim, brought home from the sea voyages. Rawiya tried to be content with her embroidery and her quiet life with her mother, but she was restless. She loved to ride up and down the hills through the olive grove atop her beloved horse, Bausa, and dream of adventures. She wanted to go out and seek her fortune, to save her mother from a life of eating barley flour porridge in their plaster house, under the stony face of Jebel Musa, watching the shore for her brother's ship. When she finally decided to leave home at 16, all Rawiya had to take with her was her sling. Her father had made it for her when she was a little girl, throwing rocks at dragonflies, and she wouldn't leave it behind. She packed it in her leather bag and saddled Bausa by the fig tree next to her mother's house. Now Rawiya was afraid to tell her mother how long she'd be gone, thinking she might try and stop her. "I'm only going to the market in Fes," Rawiya said, "to sell my embroidery." But Rawiya's mother frowned and asked her to promise to be careful. The wind came strong off the strait that day, rattling through her mother's scarf and her skirt. Rauya had wrapped a red cloth around her face and neck, hiding her new-cut hair. She told her mother, "I won't stay longer than I have to." She didn't want her mother to know she was thinking of the story she'd heard many times, the story of a legendary mapmaker who came to the market in Fez once a year. The wind opened and closed Rauya's scarf like a lung. The painful thought struck her that she did not know how long she would be gone. Mistaking her daughter's sadness for nerves, Rauya's mother smiled. She produced a misbah of wooden beads from her pocket and set it in Rauya's hands. "My own mother gave me these prayer beads when I was a girl," she said. "God willing, they will comfort you while you are away." Rauya hugged her mother fiercely and told her she loved her, trying to commit her smell to memory. Then she climbed into Bausa's saddle, and he clicked his teeth against his bit. Rauya's mother smiled at the sea. She had once traveled to Fez, and she hadn't forgotten the journey. She said to her daughter, "Every place you go becomes a part of you." Rauya said, "But none more so than home." She meant this more than anything else she'd said. And then Rauya of Bensu nudged her horse until he turned toward the inland road, past the high peaks and fertile plains of the mountainous reef where the Berbers lived, toward the Atlas Mountains and the teeming markets of Fez beckoning from the south. The trade road wound through limestone hills and green plains of barley and almond trees. For 10 days, Rauya and Bausa picked their way along the winding road ground flat by travelers' shoes. Rauya reminded herself of her plan, to find the legendary mapmaker, Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Idrisi. She planned to become his apprentice, pretending to be a merchant's son, and make her fortune. She would give a fake name, Rami, meaning the one who throws the arrow. A good, strong name, she told herself. Rauya and Bausa crossed the green hills that separated the curved elbow of the reef from the Atlas Mountains. They climbed high slopes topped by cedar forests and cork oak trees where monkeys rustled the branches. They curved down through valleys spread with yellow wildflowers. The Atlas Mountains were the stronghold of the Almohads, a Berber dynasty seeking to conquer all of the Maghreb, the northern lands of Africa to the west of Egypt. Here in their lands, every sound made Rauya uneasy, even the snuffling of wild boar and the echoes of Bausa's hooves on the limestone cliffs. At night she heard the distant sounds of instruments and singing and found it hard to sleep. She thought of the stories she had heard as a child, tales of a menacing bird big enough to carry off elephants, legends of deadly valleys filled with giant emerald-scaled snakes. Finally, Rauya and Bausa came upon a walled city in a valley. Caravans of merchants from the Sahara and from Marrakesh spilled onto the grassy plain dotted by eucalyptus trees. The green road of the Fez River split the city in two. The folded chins of the high Atlas cast long shadows. Inside the city gates, Bausa trotted between plaster houses painted shades of rose and saffron, green-crowned minarets, and gilded window arches. Rauya was dazzled by jade roofs, jacaranda trees blooming the color of purple lightning, and in the Medina, merchants sat cross-kneed behind huge baskets of spices and grains. The tapestry of colors caught her eye, the frosted indigo of ripe figs, rust red paprika, hanging lanterns of wrought metal and colored glass, and tiny petals of light that clung to shattered alleyways. Children pattered through the streets, smelling of tanned leather and spices. Rauya guided Bausa toward the center of Medina, where she hoped to find the mapmaker. Dust from the streets painted Bausa's hooves. In the heat of the day, the shade of carved stone and mosaic tile felt cool and refreshing. The cries of merchants and spice vendors deafened her. The air was thick with sweat and oil, the musk of horses and camels and men, the bite of pomegranates, the sugar song of dates. Rauya searched among the merchants and travelers, interrupting sales of spices and perfumes and salt, asking about a man who traveled weighted down by leather-bound scrolls and parchment paper sketches of the places he'd been, a man who had sailed the Mediterranean, but no one knew where to find him. Rauya was about to give up when she heard a voice. "I know the person you seek." She turned and saw a man stooped in front of a camel tied to an olive tree. He sat in a small courtyard, his white turban wrapped close around his head, his leather shoes and robe coated in a sheen of travel dust. He beckoned her closer. "You know the mapmaker." Rauya stepped into the courtyard. "What do you want with him?" The man had a short, dark beard, and his eyes as he studied her were polished obsidian. Rauya added up her words. "I'm a merchant's son," she said. "I wish to offer my services to the mapmaker. I wish to learn the craft and earn a living." The man smiled, cat-like. "I'll tell you where to find him, if you can answer 3 riddles. Do you accept?" Rauya nodded. "The first riddle," the man said, "is this." And he said, "Who is the woman who lives forever, who tires never, who has eyes in all places and 1,000 faces?" "Let me think," Rauya said. She patted Bausa's neck. Hunger and heat had made her lightheaded, and the mention of a woman made her think of her mother. She wondered what her mother was doing, probably watching the sea for Salim. It had been so long since she had thought to watch the water with her, to walk with her through the olive grove. Rabia remembered when she was small, how Baba had told her of the sea, that shape-shifting woman who never died. The sea, Rabia cried. She lives forever, always changing her moods. The sea has 1,000 faces. The man laughed. Very good. And he continued with the second riddle. What is the map you take with you, everywhere you go? The map that guides, sustains you through field and sun and snow. Rabia frowned. Who always carries a map? Do you mean a map in your head? She looked down at her hands, at the delicate veins running the length of her wrist and palm. But then, the blood makes a kind of map, she said, a net of roads in the body. The man eyed her. Well done, he said. She shifted from foot to foot, impatient. The third riddle? The man leaned forward. What is the most important place on a map? That's it, Rabia said. That's not fair. But the man only pursed his lips and waited, so she groaned and thought hard. Wherever you are, Rabia said, at that moment. The man smiled that cat smile again. If you knew where you were, why would you need the map? Rabia tugged at the sleeve of her robe. Home, then, the place you're going. But you know that if you're going there. Is that your final answer? Rabia knitted her brows. She had never even seen a map before. This riddle has no answer, she said. You wouldn't use a map unless you didn't know where you were going, unless you'd never been to a place before. And then it made sense, and Rabia smiled. That's it. The most important places on a map are the places you've never been. The man stood. Do you have a name, young riddle solver? My name is Rami. Rabia looked back toward the crowds. Will you bring me to the map maker? I answered your questions. The man laughed. My name is Abu Abdullah Muhammad Ali Raisi, scholar and map maker. I'm honored to make your acquaintance. The blood pounded in Rabia's chest. Sir! She bowed her head, flustered. I'm at your service. Then you will sail with me to Sicily within a fortnight, Ali Raisi said, to the palace of King Roger II of Palermo, where a great and honorable task awaits us. Pause there and check on my time here. Should I read another passage or should we move on? Yeah? Okay. So I'll move toward the middle. This is a passage I like a lot. This is a little bit further on in the story when they've left Syria and they've encountered another family who are also leaving on the same path, and they give them a place to stay. They're all, at this point, quite out of resources, but they continue to help each other. And this is the point at which they sort of decide on where they're going to go from here and if they want to go together, these two families. So all you need to know really is that the sort of matriarch of that second family is Sid Shadid. She's an elderly woman, and her daughter and two children, including her son Yusuf, are here in the scene as well. Sid Shadid beckons us inside when we get back to the apartment. She's rubbing Mama's back, which makes me feel good at first, because that's what I like about Sid Shadid. She always rubs her back, even when you've got nowhere to sit with the bare floor. But Mama is crying. I hold my breath and run through the possibilities. I'm on the show while we were away. Somebody died. Mama got stung by a scorpion. But the apartment is still standing and everybody's here. And even with her crooked pump still on, it's clear Mama's ankles aren't swollen. Huda sits down on a cushion, touching her sore shoulder, her sling soaked with sweat. Sara and Yusuf retreat to the corner by the window, leaning like human curtains toward a breeze they can't feel. It's almost the end of August and the summer isn't letting up. I would have been starting 7th grade soon. I was looking forward to science class, to filling in maps with the tectonic plates, and making my own battery out of a potato. But I'm not sure if they make batteries out of potatoes in Jordan. I'm not sure if I'll have to sell tissues instead. I draw close to Abu Saeed and he puts his arm around my shoulders. Mama and Sid Shadid shoot Arabic back and forth, and I bounce my knee up and down and listen. As usual, I catch the heads and tails of sentences, a sprinkling of simple words like go and south and Egypt. But then, for the first time, an entire sentence comes through, whole and clear and perfect as a ripe peach. My knee goes still. We can't stay in Jordan. The words carry so much weight that it feels like the roof should cave in. I look around to see if anybody else has noticed, but everyone is looking at the floor or off into space. Nobody seems alarmed, but nobody meets my eyes either. They drum their fingers, cough into their fists, and I realize they don't know I understand. I realize everybody is pretending, hiding their reactions where they think I can't see. Mama licks her lips like her Arabic is salt. I applied for asylum in the States, Mama says, but the paperwork is slow. They require background checks, fingerprints, screenings, interviews. Even if we complete all these things, it could take several years for us to be resettled, and there are no guarantees. Zahra whirls away from Yusuf. We're going to be here years? And what happens if we stay here all that time and we're still not granted asylum? What about school, I ask. The future spills out in front of me, suffocating hours in this tiny room, time chasing itself like a runaway marble. Mama breathes out. I've talked it over with Sid Shadid. I think we should drive south to find a better place. There is somewhere we can go, a relative of ours. He might help us if we can get to him. Mama lays her hand on Yusuf's arm. You're welcome to come with us, she says. We can figure out the rest. I bounce up. What? When are we leaving? Mama locks her eyes with mine. Her white blouse is still crisp somehow, and there aren't even any sweat stains under her arms. But the way the skin under her eyes sags and her chin creases with lines, I can tell she's not sure what to say next. It would be best if... Mama clears her throat. For now, we'll keep your hair short. I frown. But I don't like it. It's better if people think... Mama trails off. You will look like a boy, Yusuf says. Understand, it's safer that way. Noor is also a boy's name. Being seen as a boy will protect you from bad people. Mama says, not that you should be afraid. But isn't there enough already to be afraid of? I don't want to look like a boy. I wobble to my feet. I say, I want to look like myself. Abu Said calls out to me, Little Cloud. He rummages in his pocket and brings out my shard of white quartz, holding it out to me, my own words stuck on its edges, on my adventures. He asks, what do you say? I rub my smooth head. Out the window, the steppe shimmers at the city's fingertips. The farther I go, the bigger the world seems to be, and it always seems easier to leave a place than it is to come back. Did I ever let myself believe it would be easy to get back to the States, as easy as Sid Shadid giving us the room next to hers? The light shifts, hitting the blue anchusa flower in the soda can. The caramel color from the soda residue has seeped into its petals, turning it a sickly purple, even though we always say it's blue. Nobody has noticed. It seems like people lose more than they can ever get back. A 3-bedroom house, 10 inches of hair, a whole color. But nobody ever says it. Does it make it easier to live with loss if you don't name it? Or is that something you do as a mercy for other people? I drop my hand from the smooth knob at the back of my neck. The linden tree shifts its leaves and blocks the light, and the anchusa flower turns blue again. All right, I say. I'll do it. What do you think? Should I read one more, or should we move on to questions? Okay, yeah, I have one more short passage that I can read. I can if you want. I can do that. That could be the perfect timing. Maybe I should read the first one. So throughout the book, there's 5 parts to the narrative, and each part follows, so the 2 stories, because there's the present day story, there's the sort of historical fable, right? And the connection is that they both follow the same geographical route. So as Noor is telling herself this story of Rawia and the sort of band of mapmakers' apprentices is moving along the same route that Noor is taking. And so they sort of, each part is contained by a certain geographical area that's described then in a poem at the start of the part. And so I don't want to spoil what's sort of behind the poems or who has written the poems, but it's integral to the plot, and it's revealed toward the end of the book that it is plot and theme related. So I'll read the first one before the first chapter. So this is part 1, Syria, and it looks like the shape of Syria. Oh, beloved, you are dying of a broken heart. The women wail in the street. The rice is scattered and the lentils spilt. The good linen is trampled. The wadi runs with tears. In what language did you tell me that all we loved was a dream? I don't dream in Arabic anymore. I don't dream at all. When I close my eyes, I see yours, beloved. 2 pale stones in the river. Your arms, the cracked marble of centuries. The stars, your blanket. the hills stepping stones. We used to move so fast when we were dreaming. Cup the sea in your navel and wash away my tears and yours mingle, beloved. I did not want to sleep, not now, but I must. Why do we fear death when we should fear falling down? It all collapses around us. Your whispering reed, the arc of lightning in your wrists, the ransomed planets twist away. Is this where my mother was born? In the curve of your spine? I bleed. My flesh is teeming wings. Until the dawn when I flee, never will I return, oh beloved. Until that morning, wrap your pale hands around me. Fill my mouth with the fog of your breath, your heart a pomegranate seed. Oh beloved, you are with me to the end, until the sea divides, until our broken memory makes us whole. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we have time for questions, and I think our voice carries pretty well, so
yeah.
No need for our mic.
I don't bite, I'm super friendly, ask away.
Yeah. So you mentioned your interest in the classical Arabic literary tradition. What about the modern Arabic literary tradition? Do you read novelists, Egyptian or Syrian novelists?
I do, yeah. I would say at least half of what I read is modern literature from the region. I like to think that, my work is in conversation as much with contemporary American writers as it is with, contemporary writers who are writing either in Arabic or in English from the Swana region, so from Southwest Asia and North Africa. So I try to take both into account when I'm writing. Thanks. Yeah.
I guess, we've been talking a little bit about just the ways in which, the problem of the term Middle Eastern, right, and how it has such colonial implications. So we can talk about writers from the Swana region or the Levant. But in general, just what is your perception of the literary landscape and the ways in which our voices as writers from the region are often really made to be invisible or marginalized, and in this moment when we are beginning to find each other, right, and just to say, well, we are here, we can tell our stories as well. So there's a little bit of an opening that's occurring, and I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts about your expectations for that, or where we can take this moment, and what it even means that we get to be in a room together talking, which is not something that I think people can easily imagine that's actually absent from our lives, right? And absent from institutional spaces. And it's often like delving into the void, saying our bodies are not in these rooms, right? Even though the country is deeply implicated in reorganizing and distorting the region further.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you told me what the literary landscape especially in terms of Arab American writers, let's start there. If you told me what it would look like now 20 years ago, I would have been shocked. When I was growing up, there were voices, right? But it was harder to find them. There were less of them that got sort of big marketing pushes and were considered sort of mainstream writers. And I do think that I'm really grateful that we are finding each other, because I think for me and for my work, it's been a great joy to be able to sit in rooms of Swana writers, of Middle Eastern writers, what have you, and realize that there are all different sorts of people doing all kinds of things within that. I think that there is there is often this sort of expectation from sort of mainstream American literature that we're all doing the same thing, and we're not. And I think it's really exciting that now we're starting to get enough space at the table to say well, no, we're doing fabulism, and we're doing we're writing about diaspora, but we're also writing about things that have nothing to do with America. And we're writing in English, but also getting translated into Arabic or into other languages. And that wasn't always something that happened. There wasn't always crosstalk in the U.S. with Arabic language literature getting translated into English and vice versa, and I had to fight really hard to get my novel translated into Arabic. It took a really long time to find somebody. There's a huge, now, there's starting to be a really, really rich tradition of, like Swana or Middle Eastern writers who are queer, who are trans. Like there's so much happening now that it's really exciting, and I think that, in the next, I don't know where it's going to go in the next 5 or 10 years, there are a lot of us out there. And I do think it's important that we do all get together in one room, if we can, as many times as we can, as often as we can, to like have those conversations about like, okay, who are we talking to? Because I think for a long time the expectation was that we were going to sort of teach, like the dominant culture in America about who we were. And I don't think that's necessarily I think that that's still the assumption from outside, but I don't think that's what people are necessarily doing within our community anymore. I think that we are increasingly talking to each other and talking to other communities and building across those lines and saying, we have common history with lots of other groups within the U.S. Aside from sort of dominant white cis straight culture. We have a lot of links with the African American community. That literature intersects. We have a lot of links with Indigenous people here. That there's like Indigenous solidarity from the U.S. from Turtle Island to Palestine to so all of these conversations are happening now in a really exciting way. And I think they were, but it was harder to access and it was harder to find people, for people to find each other. So I'm really excited about where we're going. So yeah, thanks for letting me talk about that. Yeah.
Going off of that, so like American publishers are kind of notorious for like overlooking writers of color and LGBTQ writers. And like we were talking about how American Dirt, was so applauded in the publishing world. What was your personal experience with publishers when you were writing this book? And do you see like that landscape kind of changing in the future?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that I was lucky in that I had a publisher who really, they put a lot of support behind this, my first book especially. I was given a lot of leeway in how I was edited. That's not always the case. I definitely had the ability to sort of say, these are the things that I want to talk about, and I want to talk about them in this way. And I was able to, as a result of who my editor was and the leeway I was given, I was able to say, I want to be talking to, primarily to this group of people, and that's going to obviously drive how I'm talking about stuff. And I'm not, and like maybe, this is, and American Dirt is one example. There's a lot of other examples, but like who's telling the story and who's looking, like whose gaze it is, obviously, that drives how you tell the story. And so, in the way that we talk about violence, whether we sort of glorify it or glamorize it, there have been a lot of other people, including me, but like other people aside from me as well, that have talked about trauma pornography, that there's like this, that depending on whose gaze it is, if the gaze is itself from sort of outside of a community that isn't necessarily sensitive to what is happening, there can be violence in the gaze itself. And so anyway, all of these things, I was able to have the freedom to like take that into consideration and be like, no, I want to tell the story the way I want to tell the story. I do think also that there's been a pretty, like, there is, still a ton of work to do. I do think that there's a shift happening, and I see it in terms of, even just in terms of like talking about, or having authors as well as characters whose many different marginalized identities specifically intersect. Because my next book is actually about a transmasculine person who is Syrian American, who is Muslim, and who is queer also in terms of like, this person who's transmasculine, uses he, him pronouns, has a giant crush on his best friend who is assigned male at birth, who identifies as a cis guy and who's gay. And so like there's this relationship between these two characters where like, I don't know that 10 years ago, like I haven't been able to see that. I think it would have been really hard for me to have this book published even 5 years ago would have been a struggle. The fact that now my editor was like totally on board with this, the same editor that published my last one, I think it does make me hopeful, So I'm hopeful about the future. I think we have a lot more work to do, but we are doing the work and it's having an effect. So. Yeah.
So I'm an undergrad here, and sort of, I know in the spring of 2011 is obviously when Arab Spring happened, and sort of my entire educational career, I have been taught and viewed the Middle East as sort of just a region plagued by conflict. Can you sort of talk about how we get rid of that popular notion and like how literature can be like a vehicle for change away from just viewing a region that's always having problems and how it's more than that?
Well, I think I have to examine the we there, right? Like, I'm not sure that it's work that, like, because it's work that within the, sort of community of Middle Eastern writers in the U.S., like, we've done that work. And, the question of whether mainstream culture in this country has listened is a different question. I think that we were having a conversation today, actually, in class about how you can tell a really nuanced story, but you have to, at some point, also accept that not everyone is going to understand or listen to that story. Obviously, yes, it's true. Like, literature can be a vehicle for change and all that, but it also depends on people listening, because there are always going to be people that see it that way. I mean, American imperialism and American interests in that region depend on a narrative being that. That's the reason the narrative exists. The narrative was built that way in this country and in Europe as well. And as a result, no matter what we do, if we keep talking to that narrative and answering to that, being like, we keep saying, we're not this, then we can't do other work. And so I think at some point, at least for me in my own work, I've had to just let go of that and be like, I'm not going to talk back to that anymore. I'm actually not going to listen to that. I'm going to treat that as it's something that obviously is untrue. And so I'm not going to make that, I'm not going to put that in the center of my work, because it will actually, my work will not be as rich and interesting and of interest to me if I put that in the center of my work. There are far more interesting things for me to put in the center of my work. And so I think that that's one thing that I'm really excited about just happening in our field, in our community, that we are doing that. And we're saying, we've answered these questions before. Like, we've already proven this so many times. We've already talked about history. We've talked about who we are. We've talked about the reasons that this region is undergoing so much pain, right? Like, and what the root causes of those are, and so much of them being, European colonialism and U.S. imperialism. So those things are known. I don't think we need to rehash them. So I think it's actually important that we just stop.
Yeah. What do you think are the main drivers of how American culture views marginalized people? So, for example, as you mentioned, kind of a popular notion, but not just someone from the Middle East or someone who's trans, but someone who could be Black or Latino or also LGBT. Like, so how do you think that view changes if it's something direct that someone can do, if it's like a combination of time? A combination of time and like lots of actions by many different people.
Something that someone, can you clarify that last part of the question? I'm not sure.
How do you think culture, like as an entity, how it changes? Like the way I'm thinking about it right now is that culture kind of looks at people and there's kind of an automatic judgment. So how do you think that judgment changes, whether it's you need time naturally, whether it's the progression of a lot of many people saying little bits of things and adding their blurbs here and there? Like, what's your take on it?
Like how change happens?
Like cultural change.
Yeah, obviously so many people have weighed in on this way more eloquently than I can, especially people who are even more marginalized than me. I have a lot of privilege still, so I'm answering this from my particular position, but I think it depends a lot on who gatekeepers are for anything, not just publishing. I think that who has power has to shift, right? Because attitudes toward marginalized groups are not there by accident or by mistake. They're there because they basically shore up existing power structures. So in order for those attitudes to change, the structure of power has to change. You have to have people in positions of power who are from those marginalized groups, right? And I think if we're thinking about some very small examples, very little microcosms, like publishing, in some ways that's happening. More gatekeepers are of color, more gatekeepers are queer and trans, disabled, indigenous, etc. Right? That's starting to happen. But I think that it's hard because, anytime that you're sort of trying to act from inside an existing structure of power, you yourself are also fighting to survive, right? So like you're doing all this extra labor, and then you're also trying to pull people up after you. I think that the one thing that I can speak to about this is probably that, in terms of like I try to look at if I'm thinking about, okay, how can I affect my little tiny slice of the world, because I can only do what I can do. What I can do is any door that gets open for me, I can kick open for the next person, right? I can pull up people after me. It means that I do a lot more free labor than somebody who is not as marginalized as me, right? But like, that's usually what happens, right? Then we do extra work, and we uplift the people who are coming after us, and we try to pull them in, and we try to pull in our colleagues and say, no, I want this person to also have a space. Or, is there somebody at this conference who is Black? Are there, Indigenous and disabled people and trans people? Are they represented? Or is this going to be a panel where everybody looks the same? Like, I think sometimes we have to make those kind of often difficult choices, right? Of being like, no, I'm going to take a stand because I need to make space for people coming after me. It's not enough for me to just get through the door and then let it shut behind me. I think that's probably the most practical thing I can say, yeah.
I feel like I want to answer to your question and to your question, because I think it's important to kind of put some pressure on that question and to think about the ways in which perception might shift when we are actually honoring Black and brown leadership, but also when we're reversing the question, which is, why is America a country that needs to be at war? And we think of this region of America as not being a region of conflict or a space of conflict, but it depends on generating conflict elsewhere. So I think that that's a really important piece, because the power dynamic between the US and the Middle East is so asymmetrical that it often gets encapsulated in those terms, as though the regional conflicts in the Middle East are divorced from the larger global arena, and they aren't. Right, and they're often deeply interlinked because it's a region that's an invention of the West to a large extent. So I think that that's another thing that we can do, is turn those questions back on ourselves in terms of like the politics of violence, and also support Black and brown leadership and faculty, writers, staff, right, in all of the ways of just being self-reflexive, and then also being willing to sit down so someone else can stand up.
Yeah. And also, like, the U.S. is itself a site of conflict. I think it's totally true that that's not the way it talks about itself, but it absolutely is. So I've had book events before, people are like, oh, you're writing about a region where there's so much conflict and so much trauma. And I'm like, well, you don't have to be from Syria to be traumatized. Like, there's a lot of people in the U.S. that are traumatized. There's a lot of people in the U.S. that have lived through really awful things too, and including like police violence, including our ongoing genocide of Indigenous people. Like, there's a lot of active
and the history of slavery and ways in which those systems get purified.
Yeah.
So I think asking people to turn the question back on themselves is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for saying that too. There's a hand back there. Yeah.
So you mentioned one of the major audiences you were targeting were people who associate with more Syrians and the ethnicity that you were associating your book with. But do you think that a larger audience your book could target would be the youth who come from imperialism and colonialism? Because by exposing that diversity of thought to new generation, that makes them less likely to be more closed-minded when they're showing the story later on.
Yeah, no, I totally do. I mean, I think that a lot of the sort of the themes and the things that are learned by the narrator, I think they can absolutely be applied to lots of different communities. I think what I was trying to say was more just that, any given author, you kind of have to be narrow about your intended audience. I mean, for me personally, I'm always kind of picturing one person. Because, if I'm talking to one person, I can be, how do I say this? I'm less afraid, right? There can be more honesty, there can be more space. Whereas, if I open the door completely to, imagining what everybody and anybody will say, and how they might answer to what I'm saying, I lose my ability to be focused on that story. So, I try to be really intentional about who's in the room with me when I'm writing, in my own mind, right? Like figuratively speaking. But absolutely, that's not the only person that it can be of value to. And of course, afterward, when the book gets out there, it's been a really great joy for me to have so many different kinds of people reading it, and people from, people who are let's say, and it's gotten translated into now 20 languages, and so I've had, people from all over the world being who are maybe connected to the community of basically diasporic Syrians, let's say, or who are Arab, or who are neither of those things, right? Or who are from other cultures where there was colonialism, or there's some other way that they're connecting with it, and that's been amazing. That's a huge joy of getting to write and getting the words out there. So yeah.
One last question.
Oh, the last question. Hi. I just wanted to ask, when you were saying about centering what's actually interesting, I wanted to ask about the pleasure or the delight maybe in the historical research, because those passages are really cool, and I thought there was some pleasure in that kind of research, and maybe I just moved out of this moment to that moment.
Sure.
But I'm kind of
Yeah, so about my research process? Or...
Yeah, the historical bits, and all those delightful colors and
thank you.
smells and things.
Oh, so that part is the character, Noor's character. She has synesthesia, which is something that I have. So it's basically, the best way I can describe it is it's a neurological phenomenon where sensory input results in a sensation of color. So it can be one sense, it can be all your senses, it can be sight, sound, letters, numbers, smells, touch. It can be a lot of things. I have it with a lot of different senses. So I've given the character the way that I experience sensory, input in the world. And I did that for a lot of reasons. A lot of it was also because I wanted to give her something that made her perspective unique and made her feel like she had this unique perspective that later in the book comes in handy in a plot-related way. But that she, even though she's 12 years old and often lacks, she feels that she's powerless. She actually does have agency, and she has this unique perspective. So some of it was that. In terms of the historical research, I did a lot of research. I read thousands and thousands of pages of books about map making in that era, about navigation, about just the sort of political state of affairs at that time, both from the perspective of Europeans as well as from the perspective of people who were in the region, so I could see the greater context, right? And it was a huge area, so that was a lot of historical material. And then also things like, sort of more fun, detailed things. I read bits of period cookbooks, from the time I read somebody's thesis who was a PhD student studying textiles from that period and was recreating what those textiles might have looked like. Just really, that was more fun stuff, right? But yeah, I waded through a bunch of stuff. The biggest thing that I waded through was I would say probably close to 2,000 pages of research about star lore and legends in this region during this time and even before. So there's a bunch of really interesting treatises that were found anyway and believed to come out of Egypt that talk about what the sort of that there were all these different approaches to the constellation. So there was the way that in sort of the West, you could say, in Europe and in the US, okay, we have one set of constellations that we sort of, this is what how we look at the sky. But there were tons and tons of different traditions, including pre-Islamic Bedouin traditions that are really fascinating. And actually, in about 10 days, God, I can't believe that, I'm actually going to a residency at the Camargo Foundation in France to work on a collaborative project with my partner who's a visual artist, where we're actually putting together, based on that research, a trans-Mediterranean atlas of the night sky in at least, we're going to aim for 3 languages. Because it's so interesting, right? We have, some of it is this is the sort of tradition of the sky that is really widespread, a lot of because of colonialism, and so it's okay, we know this, but there's all these other traditions too, especially indigenous traditions that, just have been either suppressed or are no longer talked about, or, so I wanted to sort of put those on equal footing in the text and be these are equally valid ways of looking at the sky, have them in different languages, talk about the stories that are told told about the sky. So it's going to be a really interesting project. But the research is alive, in other words. It's ongoing.
Awesome.
Thanks.
I think that's a great place to kind of end.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.